Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, as promised in my Magician's Nephew video, I have recently finished rereading the second book in the Chronicles of Narnia, although the first one to be published. The one which, with most listeners out there, I imagine will be familiar because it's the one that's been adapted the most, which is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. This is the one that most people started with, certainly of my generation. In the UK, in my generation, it's almost like it's a very, very common experience for people to have experienced this book when they were children, for their parents to have read it to them, or even for their teachers to have read it to them when they were at primary school or junior school. Most people of my generation have either read this book or they know the story. There was a very famous BBC adaptation when I was very, very young, which is actually really worth a watch. It's very ropey, it's very, very theatrical, but it works somehow. It works in context with the story. The fact that the costumes are a little bit obvious, the fact that the acting is a little bit like theatre acting, the fact that it's directed more like a play than something for television works in its favour. It really does. The book is one of the purer of the Chronicles of Narnia, and I say purer in the sense that it's one of the few books in the series that is not entirely polluted by Lewis's agenda. It's certainly here. I mean, it's impossible to read the Chronicles of Narnia without coming across Lewis's very particular intention in writing the series. That said, this book certainly has more of a purer story than, say, The Magician's Nephew does. There isn't a point in this book where everything just stops dead so that Lewis can proselytize, for example. It has a cast of characters that are pretty good. It's you have the Pevensey children, who everyone knows: Edmund, Peter, Susan, and Lucy. The two older characters, interestingly, are the least characterized. Edmund and Lucy both have very strong characterization, and this seems to speak to something that was very particular in Lewis. He had this somewhat unhealthy obsession with childhood, which may derive from a number of tragedies that the man himself suffered regarding his own children. He certainly had this very particular notion of childhood innocence, which you will see very strongly and somewhat creepily manifested in some of the later books. And that seems to be the case here. Peter and Susan don't get a great deal of characterization or even much time in this book. The first two children who go through the wardrobe are Edmund and Lucy, Lucy being the first. And the other two can't even get through the wardrobe without Edmund and Lucy being there. When they try to go through on their own, they find just a wardrobe. They don't find the back of the wardrobe opening and fronds from fir trees and snow underfoot or anything like that. They just find a normal wardrobe. I like the beginning of this book. I like the earlier sequences where the children are being shipped from London as evacuees because of the war. And when they arrive at the manor where the wardrobe is being kept, it's fascinating. It's really interesting. They're in a very particular situation, being parted from their parents, being in a strange house. It's a good setup for a story. It's a really good setup, and that's where the story is actually strongest. It's a story that's very much runs on its own particular rules. Like Lucy when she does find her way through into Narnia via the wardrobe, her reaction is it's very much a person, an adult man writing a child as he wants that child to be. It's someone who doesn't necessarily remember what it's like to be a child, because her reaction is kind of nonchalant. Nobody really cares very much about the fact that they found this fantastical world in the back of the wardrobe. She just kind of sees it as a game, almost. It's just a place to explore. And that's really quite strange. You have the introduction of Mr. Tumnus, who's a peculiar character in this book. He's a faun, which is a kind of satyr-like creature. One of the reasons that Tolkien ridiculed the Chronicles of Narnia in his letters to Lewis is because he said it was absurd that you have all of these pagan images, these creatures that are derived from ancient mythologies that are antithetical to Christianity, and yet bound up within a Christian worldview. He said it's kind of ridiculous. And I kind of see that here. I do kind of see that. The Tumnus character, the faun, I like him a lot, actually. He's one of the more complex characters in the Chronicles of Narnia, in that he is somewhat sinister and yet kind of innocent at the same time. What he does and what he represents, he does under duress. It's not because he's a bad guy as such, and it's kind of sad. He has layers in a way that a lot of the Narnia characters do not. A lot of the Narnia characters are unambiguous. They are either on the side of good or they are on the side of evil. And we will see that very strongly in when we come to The Horse and His Boy, which is one of the books. You'll see when we get to it. It's a really well-written book in many respects. As a children's story, it's really well written. It just hurtles along. Unlike The Magician's Nephew, which stops stone dead at particular points so that Lewis can just basically talk at the reader and try and coerce them into his particular worldview. That doesn't happen here. The story hurtles along, and there are often multiple storylines occurring at once. So you have, at the beginning, you have Lucy in Narnia. You have the other children playing hide and seek in the house. At one point you have Edmund and Lucy in Narnia having their own adventures, and that's kind of cool. Later on you have this division between Edmund and the White Witch and the other children and the beavers are on their way to meet Aslan. It's kind of cool, and it's a rip-roaring adventure, very much of the style of children's books of this era. It just hurtles along, and the prose is really spare. I've got to say, it's really well written. It's very spare, very easy for children to read. It has its own particular internal logic, so it doesn't really concern itself with problems that an adult might ask, which works. It works in its favour. It really, really does. You do have these issues which, again, just like in The Magician's Nephew, derive from the agenda. They derive from the agenda. Aslan is a problem in this book. He's a real problem in this book. As is established pretty early through Tumnus the Faun, the White Witch, who is Jardis from the last book, from The Magician's Nephew, has somehow returned to Narnia, even though it was set up at the end of the last book that she never could, and it's never really explained how she gets back to Narnia. And she has basically conquered Narnia for thousands of years. She has been the ruler of Narnia for years, and she's a cruel tyrant. She keeps everyone under her thumb. Everyone is afraid. She has this sort of totalitarian regime where she has her own informants and her spies, and she has her own creatures in Narnia as well, her own entities and monsters and spirits that are loyal to her. And these are, in the wider mythology, these are actually problems. They're problems because Aslan created Narnia. Why do these things exist? Where did they come from? Did they come from Jardis? Did they come from the White Witch? Who knows? Who knows? You also have a problem with Aslan has purportedly been missing from Narnia for years, like centuries even, and it's never explained why. It's never explained why. Why did he allow the White Witch to reign over Narnia for this long? Why did he allow her to make it always winter and never Christmas? That's another theme of the book. Why the winter? This is something that's never really explained. Somewhere in the space between The Magician's Nephew and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Jardis went from being the character she is to being the White Witch, and she's taken on this kind of wintry aspect, but you never know where that comes from. There's no explanation for where that comes from. There is a whole story there, potentially, as to how she became the White Witch, why she makes it always winter and never Christmas. But that's never really explained. She just does it, and that's it. And there's no real explanation at all. Aslan just arbitrarily turns up again and just breaks her enchantment like that. She doesn't even know. He just, does it, and suddenly it's thawing and it's spring again, and you're sort of like, well, why didn't he just do that? You know, it doesn't make just like in The Magician's Nephew, all of the tensions, all of the dangers, all of the problems in Narnia seem to be of Aslan's making, or they seem to be allowed by Aslan insofar as it suits him. Then he just ends them. It's a problem. It's a real problem when you've got a character like Aslan, who is omnipotent, who can do whatever he likes, who makes the laws of this reality. The tension and dynamic between the White Witch and Aslan is very strange, because it's hard to see how she's much of a threat. It's hard to see how she's much of a threat at all, because all Aslan really has to do is just blink her out of existence, which he can do. And that makes it, from an adult perspective, it makes the involvement of the Pevensey children really suspicious and a little worrying. It really does, because you ask yourself, okay, so these children were drawn from their world to take part in this battle against the White Witch and the demons and incubi and creatures that she commands, putting themselves in mortal danger. For what? Why? I mean, it is revealed that Aslan called them from their world, and you're sort of like, well, why did he do that? Because he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to involve the children at all. He could just get rid of the White Witch, and that would be the end of it. It's problematic, and as an adult, when you read this story, you're sort of it is problematic. You can't help but ask these critical questions, and it's like, this actually doesn't work. This actually makes Aslan look like a complete prick. It makes him look like an arbitrary mercurial manipulator, rather than this great sort of wise, benevolent figure. I mean, one of the issues with the story is that whenever Aslan comes up, there's this kind of like sense of reverence and awe that happens that's unspoken, and it kind of feels a bit contrived. It feels forced and problematic. People, just like the Pevensey children, just sort of prostrate themselves before him, and I'm asking myself, why are they doing that? Why aren't they asking him some very serious questions about what's going on? It is problematic. You get this whole game that happens, it seems to me, whereby the White Witch, because Edmund betrays the children, there's some sort of unspoken law in Narnia, apparently, whereby any traitor in Narnia belongs to the White Witch. Why? Who knows? There's nothing that's established. It's just there, apparently. That's just part of the law of Narnia. And Aslan breaks it. He breaks that law. And it's supposed to be this moment of great self-sacrifice, because he offers himself in place of Edmund. But the thing is, Aslan is God. He's immortal. It doesn't matter if... And he knows this. He knows that even if the White Witch does kill him, he'll just resurrect, he'll just come back. He is aware of this. So his sacrifice isn't any sacrifice at all, is it? It's arbitrary. And not only that, he resurrects in like the next day. It's like, he's back. And I get it, it's the whole Christ metaphor, yeah? But it's kind of meaningless, it's contrived. It doesn't mean anything, because he established the rules. He's the one who makes the rules in this universe. He created Narnia. So he's sacrificing himself to his own system, to his own laws that he can just arbitrarily change. And I'm aware these criticisms are criticisms of Christianity, because this is the point at which the story gets really thin and you can see the agenda coming through, and it's the weakest part of the story, just as it is in all of them. It's a real problem. You just keep asking yourself, why didn't he just do that? Why didn't he just stop her in the first place? Why didn't he just wink her out of existence? Then it's all done, isn't it? No problem at all. And there's also no explanation as to why. There's this whole prophecy about when two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve sit on the thrones of this castle called Cair Paravel, then the White Witch's reign will be over. Well, why? Where does that prophecy come from? What's the mechanism of it? Why? Why does it have to be that way? It's unnecessary. It's a real problem with this story, and it's very difficult to get over as an adult. It's very difficult. These logical questions and it's not. I know you can hand wave it away and say, "Oh, it's just a children's story." There are children's stories that run on internal logic that are consistent, that even when they include magic and fantasy, they are consistent. I mean, one of the strongest contemporaries, The Lord of the Rings. Everything that happens in The Lord of the Rings has its own peculiar logic within that world. You know? It makes sense within that world. Not everything that happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe makes sense even within that mythology, even within that world. There are just far too many unanswered questions. Also, I mean, for me, there are some, and I actually like this element of the book, I've got to say. There's a period at the end of the story when the Pevensey children live in Narnia for years. They actually grow up in Narnia, and they become adults. They actually become the kings and queens of Narnia. And for me, it's really creepy, but in an interesting way, because they grow up in Narnia, so they become the kings and queens of Narnia. They have the whole life experience of adults, yeah? They experience adult drives and adult desires, and then they go back home. Arbitrarily, it seems. After an arbitrary number of years, they are led accidentally back through the woods and back through the wardrobe. And when they emerge, they're children again. And it's like, that's really creepy. For me, as an adult reading that's really creepy. Because do they remember? Do they remember not only Narnia, but do they remember being adults? Because that's weird. That's problematic. Because they are now effectively, psychologically, adults in children's bodies. And that's really creepy. That sets up some real problems. I'm going to do it. I tell you, ladies and gents, I'm going to do it. I am going to write a series of stories whereby they will be the Pevensey children and them coping with living in the real world after having grown up as kings and queens of Narnia, because that would do a number on you. Psychologically, you would be damaged after that. There would be sincere and serious problems. And I would love to explore that, because I think it would be really interesting. It's part of the unspoken perversity of Lewis's stories, and there's a lot of it in there. We'll get to it when we get to some of the more problematic ones, like The Horse and His Boy, like The Last Battle. There are some really problematic elements in those stories. It's one of the many, many sincere problems of this book and of this series. But it's also one that kind of inspires storytelling in and of itself, and I really like that, as you try to explore it, as you try to sort of imagine it and explore the complexity of it as an adult. So when we come back, the next one I believe the next one is Prince Caspian. One of the lesser books in this series, it has to be said. It's more of a transitional story than anything, but we'll explore that when we come to it. Until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!